Morning, be seated.
Application 2 of 2021, rescind location allowance general order number 10 of 2020 and issue a new general order.
Now we have Mr McGregor for the Minister, Mr Moss for the CCI and Mr Diamond, Dr Diamond I should say, for Unions WA. Now I think you have a minute of proposed order which my associate has provided to you, which should come as no surprise to you all. I think you've seen all the material and the schedules to the proposed variations, and I believe they're all agreed. So unless there's anything that anyone wishes to add from the bar table, a collective shaking of the heads, I take that to be a no. Well, what we'll do then is perhaps the best thing to do would be to suggest that perhaps by lunchtime next Tuesday you let my associate know if there are any issues arising from the minute. I doubt whether there will be, but if just in case there are, if you can let my associate know. But otherwise, we think the matter can proceed very simply on that basis, and I'd like to thank you all for your cooperation and acknowledge the work of the registry staff as well in facilitating the making of the general order for location allowances. So having shortly dealt with that matter, thank you very much. Madam Associate, please call on the next matter.
Application 1 of 2021, 2021 state wage order pursuant to section 50 capital A of the Act.
Thank you. Now we note the only change of appearance is Mr Entrican for the Minister, otherwise no change. Now today we're sitting of course to hear from you all in relation to the Fair Work Commission's annual wage review 2020-21, which was handed down on 16th of June. So should we turn to you, Mr Entrican?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. So the expert panel of the Fair Work Commissions determined that the national minimum wage and modern award wages will increase by 2.5%. This increase will apply from the 1st of July 2021 for most employees. However, the increase has been delayed for a select number of awards. I'll return to that issue in a minute.
Yes.
In awarding a 2.5% increase to minimum wages, the expert panel considered a range of economic, social and legislative criteria contained in the Fair Work Act. It noted there was broad consensus that the current performance of the economy has exceeded expectations and that the economic recovery was well underway. The expert panel also noted the Australian economy has recovered to a greater extent and more quickly than anticipated, and outlined a wide range of economic forecasts from the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Federal Treasury that have improved quite dramatically since last year's national wage decision. The Minister's earlier submission to this year's state wage case also drew attention to the significant improvement in the state economy since last year's proceedings, and outlined a wide range of indicators that have exceeded expectations with regard to Western Australia's recovery from the impacts of COVID-19. The Minister submits the West Australian workers should enjoy a fair and sustainable increase in minimum and award wages in this year's state wage case, and has advocated for an increase of $19.20 per week, which would actually raise the minimum wage by approximately 2.5%. The Minister contends that the expert panel's decision to award a 2.5% increase to the national minimum wage and modern award wages is an equitable and considered one, and appropriately balances the statutory criteria that it's required to have regard to. The Minister notes the expert panel's decision will increase the national minimum wage by $18.80 per week, taking it to $772.60 or $20.33 per hour. However, as a percentage increase, it will increase modern award wages above the statutory minimum by more than $18.80 per week. As a flat dollar increase, the Minister's proposed position of $19.20 would increase most state award wages by less than 2.5% by virtue of the fact it's flat dollar. And in this regard, the Minister's position could be viewed as somewhat modest in the circumstances. The expert panel specifically noted that awarding an increase which is less than increases in prices and living costs would amount to a real wage cut, and that such an outcome would mean that many award-reliant employees, particularly low-paid employees, would be less able to meet their needs. The expert panel ruled out awarding an increase below inflation and living costs including a wage freeze, which was advocated by several employer groups. For the same reasons, the expert panel rejected a wage freeze in the national wage decision. The Minister submits the Commission and Court session should similarly reject a wage freeze in this year's state wage case. While the expert panel ruled out a wages cut, it also stated that awarding an increase of the magnitude proposed by the ACTU and the Australian Catholic Council for Employment Relations, and those organisations were seeking increases of 3.5% and 4% respectively. The expert panel said that that would pose a risk of disemployment and of adversely affecting the employment opportunities for low-skilled and young workers. The Minister contends that a similar point could be made in the context of the state wage case, and that a 4% increase in minimum and award wages, as advocated by Unions WA and WACOS, may be excessive in the current environment. The expert panel also noted that it's taken the 0.5% increase in the superannuation guarantee rate into account in determining the level of the increase awarded in this year's national wage decision. However, it hasn't applied a direct quantifiable discount to the minimum wage. The Minister submits this was a sensible approach and contends that for similar reasons it's generally not practicable to apply a formulaic or quantifiable approach to the superannuation issue when considering the level of the increase for the state wage case.
Yes.
The Minister notes that not all employees will benefit from the increase in the superannuation guarantee. In particular, employees under 18 who are engaged for less than 30 hours per week, employees who earn less than $450 per month, and some employees engaged on total salary packages, which we've heard a lot more about in the last few days. While the Commonwealth Government has announced some changes in this year's federal budget that will expand access to superannuation, including the removal of the $450 per month threshold for receiving contributions, those reforms require legislative amendment and they aren't due to commence until mid-2022. I'll now turn to the timing of any increase awarded in this year's state wage case.
Yes, thank you.
In the 2020 National Wage Decision, the expert panel determined that it would increase modern award minimum wages in three groups based on industry clusters. Depending on the cluster, increases to minimum award wages occurred on either the 1st of July 2020, the 1st of November 2020 or the 1st of February 2021. Modern awards covering those industries that were less affected by COVID-19, as well as frontline workers engaged in essential services who continued to work through the pandemic, were increased from the 1st of July 2020. It was estimated that about 25% of non-managerial award-reliant employees were covered by this cluster. Modern awards covering industry sectors adversely affected by the pandemic, but not to the same extent as those were the hardest hit, were increased from the 1st of November 2020, and it was estimated that about 40% of non-managerial award-reliant employees were covered by this cluster. And then finally, modern awards covering industry sectors which had been adversely affected, or the most adversely affected by the pandemic, were increased from the 1st of February 2021. It was estimated that just over 1/3 of all employees, or approximately 35% of non-managerial employees, were in this cluster. In this year's National Wage Decision, the expert panel has substantially reduced the number of awards and therefore also the number of employees who will be subject to a deferred implementation for the deferred implementation date for the increase it's awarded. The expert panel specifically rejected calls from some employer bodies that there be a minimum of 12 months between wage increases for all industries. The expert panel determined that most national system employees will receive an increase from 1st of July this year, and has acknowledged that for many employers this will mean 2 wage increases in a matter of months. However, the expert panel made several important points on this issue. Firstly, it noted that the mere fact that there was a deferred implementation date for the increase in last year's review was not in itself an exceptional circumstance that warrants a deferral in this year's review. Secondly, the expert panel noted that these employers had the benefit of the delayed operative date arising from last year's decision. The Minister contends that these points are also relevant in the state wage case proceedings. The expert panel commissioned Professor Jeff Borland to conduct further research on the economic effects of COVID on various industry sectors. The expert panel also examined relevant industry-specific data, the period of time between successive review increases, and the likelihood that future lockdowns will be of limited duration and localised to particular regions. In relation to lockdowns, the Minister notes that the national wage decision is conducted on the basis of issues affecting the whole country, and the extensive and prolonged lockdowns experienced in Victoria in the past year are likely to have had somewhat more acute impact on aggregate national incomes when compared with the experience in Western Australia over the same period. Having extensively canvassed the issues affecting the date of effect of any increase in this year's national wage decision, the expert panels determined that a much smaller number of national modern awards will be subject to a deferred increase. The awards that are subject to deferral are mainly concentrated in the aviation, tourism, recreation, hospitality and non-food retailing sectors, and in some cases only parts of these sectors are subject to a deferral. The 2.5% increase for these awards takes effect from the 1st of November 2021. Additionally, the increase for the General Retail Industry Award 2020 will take effect from the 1st of September this year. The expert panel noted that while some businesses covered by this award have not been adversely affected by the pandemic to any significant extent, there were pockets within the retail trade that have been more adversely affected. The Minister submits that for a range of practical and legal reasons, it would not be possible to similarly defer any increase in the state wage case only for the same industries. For one, many of the national modern awards that are subject to a deferral in the national wage decision have no equivalent state award in Western Australia. The national modern awards that do have an equivalent state award are mostly concentrated in the retail and hospitality industries. However, even here there are major differences between the state and national awards, which would make replicating the national wage decision near impossible with regard to the deferrals. For instance, the expert panel specifically determined the Fast Food Industry Award 2010 would not be subject to a deferred implementation date, as this industry is less likely to have been adversely affected by the pandemic than cafes and restaurants, particularly as restrictions imposed to contain the virus have generally not prohibited takeaway food services. And again, the Minister notes that some of this is obviously influenced by the lockdowns in Victoria. In Western Australia, most fast food establishments are subject to the Restaurant, Tea Room and Catering Workers Award, which also covers cafes and restaurants. It would therefore not be possible to defer the state wage increase for cafes and restaurants, but not fast food at the same time. A further logistical difficulty with replicating the national wage decision with regard to deferrals is the fact that the state minimum wage is implied into all state awards. So any situation in which the state minimum wage increased prior to an increase in award rates in a particular industry could lead to significant complexity if the award rates are close to the state minimum. If the state minimum wage was to increase prior to the wage rates in an award, the new state minimum wage and that new state minimum wage exceeded one or more rates in the award, the new state minimum wage would become payable and take precedence, notwithstanding the award itself is yet to be varied. Because of these logistical issues, the only weight increase in the state wage case could be deferred for particular awards, would be to defer the increase to the state minimum wage as well at the same time. And the Minister contends this would penalise thousands of additional workers throughout the state in industries that are largely unaffected by COVID-19 or have rebounded strongly from it. For all of these reasons, the Minister contends the most practical course of action in this year's state wage case is for all minimum and award wages to be increased from the same date, and the Minister submits that that should be the 1st of July 2021. In conclusion, the national wage decision does not give rise to a change in the Minister's position in these proceedings, and the Minister still supports an increase of $19.20 per week to minimum and award wages. If it pleases the Commission and Court session, that concludes the Minister's submission.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Mr Inchikin. Mr Moss.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. So to confirm, CCI does rely on its previous submissions
Yes, of course.
made in this matter. As Mr Inchikin noted, the Fair Work Commission has increased the national minimum wage by $18.80 per week. That decision, should everything remain the same, brings the national minimum wage $12.60 per week, or 1.66% higher than the current level of the state minimum wage. In reaching its decision, the Fair Work Commission has acknowledged that, as was the case last year, this review is still being undertaken during a global pandemic. And whilst they've noted the improvement in the economy broadly, they've also recognised that the risk of domestic outbreaks and ongoing disruptions to other major economies, and in particular that COVID-19 outbreaks necessitating further containment measures, continue to remain a risk. And that even localised outbreaks have an impact on consumer and business confidence, weighing on consumption and investments, and they've identified that at paragraph 44 of their decision. This is a fairly similar situation to the WA economy, albeit in our case, the strong economic performance of the WA economy is being driven by two key forces. The first, of course, being the success of the mining sector, which now accounts for 43% of the state's economy, as well as significant levels of government stimulus being injected in local economies. With respect to this matter, we do note and observe that the private sector businesses most likely to be affected by the state wage case decision, broadly speaking, fall into those industry sectors which continue to be the most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the most susceptible to the impact of future restrictions. As we've noted in our initial submissions, the lockdown and increased restrictions experienced over the course of this year have had a demonstrable effect on the economy as a whole, but more importantly, they had a significant impact on industries such as the accommodation, food and retail sectors, which are overrepresented as employers covered by the state industrial relations system. The Fair Work Commission's also recognised that the pace of the vaccine rollout is key to the effective containment of COVID-19 and reducing the uncertainty about the impact of future outbreaks, and they've identified that in paragraph 53. Now, we're fortunate that over the recent months there's been an increase in the proportion of the population who's been eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, but Australia still does lag substantially behind the rest of the world. At paragraph 22 of our initial submission, at our submission in reply, we included a graph that highlights the proportion of vaccine doses per 100 employees and the comparison of that with other countries. In May, this was 11.03 vaccines per 100 persons. And over the course of a few months, this has increased to 23.26 per 100 persons. That's as at 16th of June 2021. However, we do continue to remain well below the rate of most developed countries, as well as some developing countries. The United Arab Emirates, for example, currently has the highest inoculation levels of 142.2 doses per 100 persons. So that equates to 100% of their population having received their first dose of vaccine and 42% having received their second dose of the vaccine. Whereas by comparison, in Australia, only 23% have received their first vaccine. In US, the level's at 93.56 doses per 100 persons. Canada's sitting at 80.48. UK 106. Chile at 109. Australia sits between Brazil at 38.36 per 100 persons and India, which sits below us, at 18.72. So if we're looking at the concern or the issue that we have, that an increased rollout of the vaccine is one of the strong keys to be able to reduce the level of, or reduce the likelihood of future lockdown and restrictions. The improvement that we're seeing in the vaccination rate is definitely a really good step forward in that, but we still have a long way to go before we start to remove that risk altogether.
Our success is probably also partially because of geography, given our island status and closed borders, which has a sting in the tail, of course, in terms of the labour market as it's tightening and difficulties that's creating. But that's another factor which is impacting on our ability to operate as a country economically compared to many countries now. For example, the UK, which, although it has a high vaccination rate, as you now know, as everyone knows, is in the grip probably of a third wave by the look of things.
That's right, and we are in a fortunate position being an island nation, and the ability that, or the steps that both the state and federal governments have taken to control the spread of COVID-19. We have become a lot more protected in that respect from the adverse health outcomes. The disadvantage, as you alluded to or identified, though, is it's also then restricting the free flow of labour, and that's both labour coming into Australia, but labour going out. And it's impacting on a lot of our businesses who rely on sending skilled labour to perform functions and activities outside of Australia, in the same way as a number of WA businesses have had similar effects with respect to tendering for jobs that are being performed on the East Coast because of the previous stronger hard border systems that we've had here. I'd like to turn quickly to the superannuation element. As identified and consistent with previous decisions, the Fair Work Commission's taken into consideration the 0.5 percentage point increase in determining their decision, and they've identified that the wage review decision is lower than what would otherwise have been the case had the super contributions not increased. We encourage the Commission and Court Session to take a similar approach in line with previous state wage case decisions where there's been an increase in superannuation contributions. With respect to the exemptions and issues that Mr Enkren has raised, we do note, however, the exemptions from superannuation payment are very limited. The vast bulk of employees do receive superannuation contributions. I'd also note that the comments that have come up in the press recently around salary packaging arrangements are not arrangements that apply to award-based employees, award-reliant employees. By the very nature, if someone is paid at award-reliant elements, then of course, in line with any increases in wages, super increases will need to increase as well. Our experience is...
Essentially, those are contractual issues, common law contracts between employers and employees.
Yeah, and our experience has been that they tend to apply very much to very senior management roles, more so in some select industries, and highly specialised technical positions. Once again, people paid well in excess of any award entitlements. With respect to the Fair Work Commission's approach in not identifying a direct quantifiable discount to the minimum wage, we believe that that is a weakness in that respect. We do believe that it is appropriate that there be a clear amount by which any increase is reduced, taking into account of that. Our view is that that should be the full 0.5 percentage point, taking into account the impact that, or the increase that the super contributions have to the overall labour costs for employers, particularly with respect to the current environment. Looking at the quantums of positions, we do note that the Fair Work Commission comment with respect to the ACTU claim is, we believe, true with respect to Unions WA claim in the state system. However, we do disagree with the view expressed by the Fair Work Commission that an increase at or below the current level of inflation would mean that the living standards of low-paid employees would fall. The Fair Work Commission has taken the view that the requirement to take into account relative living standards and needs of the low-paid supports an increase. However, in our view, this approach ignores a couple of key issues. The first is that the cumulative effect of wage decisions are significantly higher than both inflation and average wage growth. So as outlined in our initial submission with respect to WA minimum wage, over the 5-year period from 2015 to 2020, Perth CPI grew by 5.2%, wage price index grew by 9.8%, whilst the state minimum wage increased by 13.7%. So over the number of years, and this is a relatively historical trend, state wage case decisions always keep pace ahead of inflation, and over the last 5 years also wage growth generally. We also note that the rebound in the labour market since the commencement of the pandemic has seen a significant growth in part-time employment at the expense of full-time employment. And as identified in our initial submission, in the accommodation and food services industry, the proportion of part-time and casual workers has increased from 58% in February 2020 to 62% in February 2021. And the retail sector, the number of part-time casual roles now accounts for 56% compared to 54% prior to the pandemic. This shift towards part-time employment is also reflected in the May labour force statistics that were released yesterday, in which the number of employed people increased marginally by 900 people in the month from April to May. But that comprised of a 7,400 increase in part-time jobs, offsetting a 6,500 decline in full-time employment. If we look at the changes since February 2020, whilst the number of jobs in WA has increased by 8,200, that's because that is a result of part-time employment increasing by 19,500, whilst full-time jobs have slipped by 11,300. Likewise, we note that the drop in the employment rate to May to 4.7%, it's a 0.3 percentage point drop, was principally as a result of the fall in the participation rate to 67.8. That was a drop of 0.2 percentage points, as around 3,000 people exited the labour market. The increase in part-time employment means that a greater proportion of the workforce is susceptible to a variation in working hours. The Commission's previously recognised the Productivity Commission view that, faced with higher wages for lower skilled workers, businesses have an incentive to reduce employment of workers and or invest in labour displacing capital, hire skilled workers, or seek to pass on the costs. The potential impact of wage increase on working hours is greater, we believe, where the increase is higher than capacity of employers to pass on increased costs to consumers. In our mind, this raises a significant concern in the current environment of the impact of any increase which is greater than CPI, given the significant variations in working hours over the course of the year, which reinforces the volatility within the labour market.
I note, Mr Moss, that the Fair Work Commission also had regard to the ABS published series that Dr Diamond referred us to, that being the non-discretionary and discretionary costs at paragraphs 113, 114 of their decision, and were prepared to consider that as a relevant consideration in assessing the impact on the low paid, and particularly the ability of the low paid to meet essential living costs.
Yeah.
Did you wish to say anything about that?
I'll reinforce some comments that we made in our submission in reply with respect to that particular research. So that was a research done as part of their graduate program as a one-off study. They are seeking some comment on that, so it's not one that they've...
They haven't locked it in yet.
No, precisely. So they're still looking at that. We did note in our submission in reply that there are some things in the discretionary basket which seem a little bit questionable as to whether it's discretionary and vice versa. It's an interesting report and it probably has some merits looking at in future, but it looks like there's still some very rough edges around it. So I'd be mindful about taking too much by way of consideration and rather repeat the views that the Commission and court sessions had in previous years about the CPI headline figure, or CPI being probably the most reliable indication of what's going on. Noting that there are sometimes fluctuations based on explained circumstances coming out of that one. I'd probably suggest that's one to look in future years once they've had the opportunity to refine it a bit further.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah. So one of our primary concerns with the way in which the employment market has shifted, particularly around the part-time, is a substantial increase or a high increase in wages may actually be to the detriment of low-paid workers if it means they have fewer working hours as a result of it. We note that the national increase of 2.5% is substantially higher than national CPI, which currently sits at 1.1% in the 12 months to March 2021. In doing so, the Fair Work Commission has granted an increase which is more than double the increase in cost of living. We believe that such an increase puts significant pressure on employers and ultimately impacts on working hours and job security to those of water-reliant workers. We don't believe that the WA Industrial Relations Commission should follow the example set by the Fair Work Commission. In particular, we are especially concerned that any increase in excess of $12.60, or 1.66%, would continue to see WA sole traders disadvantaged where compared to their larger national system competitors. As to the form of any increase, in this year's decision, the Fair Work Commission has reinforced its concern that flat dollar increases in modern award minimum wages have compressed award relativities and reduced the gains from skill acquisitions. We appreciate that that is a valid concern, but we do maintain the view that any increase as part of this year's state wage case decision should be a flat dollar amount. And the reason why we're preferencing that this year as distinct from a percentage increase is it provides the greater benefit to the lower paid classifications, which are the people who are most reliant on the safety net adjustments, whilst minimising the higher cost impact that is derived from a percentage-based increase. As far as operative date, as Mr Jenkins already identified, in considering the operative date, the Fair Work Commission has identified that because there was a deferred date of operation of the increase last year does not necessarily automatically warrant that there be an increase in this year's review. But having said that, it did accept that the period of time between successive increases, together with other data, is relevant in the overall assessment of whether exceptional circumstances do exist to warrant a delayed operative date. And in particular, paragraph 246 of their decision, they've identified some key matters relevant to the assessment of the operative dates for this year. That being relevant industry-specific data, the period of time between successive increases, and the likelihood of future lockdowns. Noting that lockdowns are likely to be limited in duration, localised and comprising of staying-at-home orders, which limits the capacity or reasons for people leaving their home. They note that in relation to that last matter, the expected pattern of future lockdowns is likely to adversely impact industries such as hairdressing and beauty services, gyms, retail stores, other than those providing essential foods, accommodation hospitality businesses, and noting other than takeaway food services, and businesses operating in the tourism and entertainment/sports sector. With respect to the retail sector, they identified that turnover and jobs data shows considerable diversity and experience across the various components of the retail sector, and that the degree of the impact is likely to be influenced by location. Is it CBD, metro, regional? The subsector in which the business operates, and the size of the business. In particular, they identified that smaller businesses are less likely to have the resources to quickly pivot to online sales and are more likely to operate in a limited number of locations. So in particular, the smaller businesses are the one which are most vulnerable, And once again, I'll identify that with respect to those businesses covered by the state industrialisation system, they are more likely to be smaller businesses. The Fair Work Commission ultimately concluded on the establishment of 3 operation dates. As has been identified, 1 July for the majority of awards, 1 September for general retail, and then 1 November 2022 for those industries which continue to be most affected, which includes hospitality, accommodation, tourism and the personal services sector. Once again, we note that these are some of the sectors which are most likely to be impacted by this decision.
One of the issues in this case is that, certainly on the evidence of Mr. Christmas, the impact on the hospitality industry, for example, it has been mixed. Some sub-sectors of the sector have done better than others. I think from memory that restaurants, cafes and the like have generally performed quite well and returned to the pre-pandemic levels of activity and employment, whereas hotels, taverns, bars have done less well. So there's not uniform data and material before us as to, or perhaps I should withdraw that and say, one can't put a ruler across it and say that every business is in the same boat. There will be variations naturally.
Yeah, and that's an issue that can, I think, be drawn when looking at this matter in any year, of course. You know, some businesses do better than others. There are industry variations and groups within particular industries. So, for argument's sake, and I'll draw your attention to our submissions where we looked at the impact of the lockdowns, the most recent lockdowns, on businesses in the Perth, Peel and also the southwest. So if you're looking at, say, a small or a local cafe or restaurant in the north of the state, the impact that they've had as far as lockdowns has been far less. They've not been captured by the most recent lockdowns, and so for them it's been business as usual. If we're looking at things like the hotels and taverns and the entertainment industries, for them the nature of the lockdowns and the restrictions have been far more significant than for, say, restaurants and cafes. But if we look at things like the recent Perth and Peel lockdowns, the impact of those has been far greater than just the Perth and Peel area. The recent Perth lockdown, so back with respect to April, had a significant impact on a lot of the businesses in the southwest who were looking forward to a lot of Perth people coming and spending their money over the long weekend, which then, of course, clearly didn't happen. Or for those Perth people who managed to get out before the lockdown commenced, were then not able to go out and spend money and enjoy themselves whilst they were down there. So the impacts, as you identified, can be varied and significant, or can be varied, but we believe that there is a significant impact, particularly on small businesses, and particularly in the face of declining government support out of that process. So we've gone past the issue of JobKeeper and that. So increasingly businesses are relying on themselves for future lockdowns.
And it may well be that the bulk of those businesses are in the main central city locations, such as far fewer in the regions, for example, compared to major city locations such as Perth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we look at the population distribution within Western Australia, clearly the centralisation is towards the southwest land division, particularly the Perth metro area as well, which of course is the group, given the high density of living, is the group which is most susceptible to future lockdowns too.
Yes, thank you.
In last year's decision, last year's state wage case decision, the Commission deferred the effect of the 1.75% increase to the 1st of January this year. And that did provide those businesses affected by the decision to the opportunity to prepare for the increase, and also having the benefit of allowing for improved trading conditions as the worst of the impact from the first wave of restrictions was starting to ease. Whilst conditions have improved since this time last year, those sectors most likely to be impacted by the decision continue to be those most affected by ongoing restrictions and at the greater risk of the impact of further lockdowns and restrictions should they occur. We therefore believe that there remains a strong need to defer the operation of any increase arising from this year's decision, particularly given that wages were increased less than 6 months ago, and that as a result of the unavoidable delay in handing down state wage case decisions, employers will have very little time to prepare and consider how they will deal with any increase arising in the event of a 1 July implementation date. We do note that Unions WA claim that employers know an increase occurs at this time every year, but I do expect they might concede the point that employers can't predict what that increase will be in any given year, at least not until such time as the Commission announces its decision. So it's not something that we can prepare for because we don't know what the quantum or the increase will be. I note Mr Indrakin's views with respect to having multiple effective dates, that unlike the Fair Work Act, the Industrial Relations Act does not easily facilitate the establishment of multiple commencement dates. Consequently, we believe that there should only be a single commencement date for any increase. As we identified in our submissions, for those industries most affected by the decision, there remains ongoing challenges arriving out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and these will continue to impact on these businesses and their employees, whilst the risk of future lockdowns and restrictions remain. We do believe that this risk will diminish as the vaccine rollout continues, providing therefore government greater confidence it can manage the risk of future outbreaks without resorting to snap lockdowns and restrictions. The problem is we're not there yet. And as such, we'd recommend that the Commission defer the operative date of any increase that it grants as part of this process to the first pay period commencing on or after the 1st of November this year, in line with the Fair Work Commission decision. May it please the Commission in court session, that's our comments with respect to the Fair Work decision.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Dr. Don.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. May it please the Commission in court session, Unions WA's position on the state minimum wage remains unchanged as a result of the Fair Work panel decision on the national wage. We continue to request that the WA Commission issue a general order pursuant to Section 50A of the Act to increase award wages and the statutory minimum wage by 4% or $30.40 a week, whichever is the greater. This increase should, in our view, be awarded in full, be implemented in full for all award workers from the first pay period after the 30th of June. We continue to rely on our written submissions for our principal case. However, there are aspects to the national decision that Unions WA would like to bring to the Commission's attention, which we believe are relevant to state wage case considerations. Unions WA accepts that the 2.5% increase in the national minimum wage announced by the FWC is a step in the right direction for millions of workers who rely on it and the award system, but it still falls far short of what is needed, particularly in regards to the operative dates. The Fair Work President said that the decision took account of the markedly better economic environment. The broad consensus is that the current performance of the economy has exceeded expectations and the economic recovery is well underway. Unfortunately, once again from Unions WA's arguing, the practicalities of the decision delay the increase until the 1st of November for the aviation, tourism and hospitality sectors, the fitness sector and certain retail trade awards such as hairdressers, and general retail businesses will not see increases until the 1st of September, of course. While this is a smaller number of awards than delays in previous years, we are still very disappointed that the FWC has delayed increases for any but particularly those who have worked throughout the pandemic and whose employers have posted not just profits but also record profits. Now, the panel did acknowledge that awarding an increase, which is less than increases in prices and living costs, would amount to a real wage cut. However, in our view, the 2.5% increase continues the approach of what in our view amounts to wage suppression in Australia. Suppressing wages growth, as has been pointed out by numerous commentators and including the governors of the Reserve Bank, hurts economic recoveries and it hurts working people, their families and communities. There can be no economic recovery, no full economic recovery without a wages recovery. And the impact of relatively low and indeed far too low in our view increases to minimum award rates can actually be seen in the federal government's own submission to the national wage case, which of course, as is the practice, didn't propose a figure. But nevertheless, in its chapter 8.5, it showed the impact of the panel's 2020 decision on household income. That was a 1.75% increase, and it really resulted in little to no increase for practical purposes. The best outcome was for a single person with no children. A $13 a week became $11 a week after tax, which made it a 1.48% rise. A single parent working full-time on the minimum wage with a 3-year-old child only really received $5 worth of the increase. And a single income couple, one full-time minimum wage, the other on JobSeeker, really only increased their disposable income by $2. So our point there is that the increase of small increases to minimum award wages, coupled with delayed operating dates, is really very, very small from the point of view of households. And when you consider that this process is the only avenue many workers have for a pay rise each year, a pay increase of 2.5%, that is delayed for certain key sections, is simply not making an appropriate contribution to the economy, and it is not making an appropriate contribution to living standards. By contrast, a substantial minimum wage increase will be spent in local communities across WA and across the country, and is essential for helping small and medium businesses as well as working people get back on their feet after the pandemic. With that in mind, we believe that the WA Commission needs to award a higher minimum wage than this national decision, and its operative dates should not be delayed. So with that in mind, moving on to some specific points, in its decision, the Fair Work panel observed, and it's paragraph 32, 33 of its decision, that national accounts for the March quarter 2021 showed that the GDP grew by about 1.1% over the year, meaning that the level of GDP had exceeded the March quarter 2020 when the pandemic began. That also amounted to an increase in GDP per capita. And the panel also referred to recent statements from the Reserve Bank, specifically it's paragraph 33, the RBA's May 2020 statement on monetary policy, and even the the May 2021 statement on monetary policy and the February 2021 statement, pointing out that GDP growth was revised up, as we said, from 8% to 9.25% over the year to June quarter 2021. Household consumption was revised up from 14% to 15.5% over the year to June quarter 2021. The unemployment rate, national unemployment rate, revised down from 16.5% to 5.25% for June 2021. The Consumer Price Index revised up from 3% to 3.25% for June 2021. And similarly, for the Wage Price Index revised up from 1% to 1.5% for the June quarter. In our view, though, that this we have previously stated in our submissions and in presentations to the Commission that a lot of these projections are still effectively either projecting a real wage cut overall, or at the very least, certainly stagnant wages. And the 2.5% increase decision from the panel, we believe, still continues to risk that being the case. Unions WA argued in its main submissions that the WA Commission, and indeed wage commissions across the country, need to exercise their institutional power to increase minimum and award wages. The divergence between profits, the divergence between productivity and unit labour costs and what people are actually taking back shows that employers are really exercising their power in the labour market to avoid wage increases. And I'll touch on that a little later on in this presentation as well. A 4% increase, just to stick with percentages for the moment, in award wages would in that sense be a modest and consistent increase that would actually improve the position of the low paid and improve wages growth. Now, in discussions about the situation with the vaccine rollout, the Fair Work panel observed in its paragraph 51 that there are four of the key assumptions underpinning the economic forecast for the 2021-2022 federal budget are that during 2021, localised outbreaks of COVID-19 are assumed to occur but are effectively contained. While most domestic activity restrictions have been listed, it is assumed that general social distancing restrictions and hygiene practices will continue until medical advice recommends removing them. The lifting of domestic activity restrictions will help support consumer and business activity. There are also no extended or sustained state border restrictions in place over the forecast period. And while inbound and outbound international travel is certainly expected to remain low through to mid-22, there is still a gradual recovery in international tourism assumed to occur. They go on to point out, based on the broadly consistent pattern following Victoria's second wave, during which the state was locked down for many months, future lockdowns are likely to be of limited duration and localised, with most states locking down regions rather than the whole state. Turning in that sense specifically to Western Australia, we note that the state government earlier in June announced that people aged 30 to 49 years in WA are now eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine in state-run clinics. And all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 16 and over are now eligible. A week after that announcement, they pointed out that an increase of 100,000 appointments made for COVID vaccinations in WA. And just recently, it was also given the case that people aged 50 to 59 years will also be able to get the Pfizer vaccine. So in WA, if we're considering the importance of a vaccine rollout, the vaccine rollout is not just proceeding, it is also being scaled up, which will considerably reduce the risks of lockdown into the future. Moving on to some of the points made about the significance of the superannuation increase. It's fair to say that unions do have a difference of opinion with the Commission about the significance of a 0.5 percentage point increase in the superannuation guarantee rate. But we do accept and highlight the point that they've said, that they do not think that a direct quantifiable that it should not be applied in such a way to have a direct quantifiable discount to the minimum wage increase. And the Commission has also said in its paragraph 61 that it agrees with the Australian Council of Trade Unions submission that it is not appropriate for the panel to take its superannuation increase into account until the relevant legislation has passed and the costs to award reliant employers can be estimated. With that in mind, I'll turn briefly to the significance of tax measures such as the low and middle income tax offset, which has been retained for a period of time for the next financial year. This also should not weigh upon the Commission's decision in the sense that it should not mean that an increase to the minimum wage should be less than it would otherwise be. The Fair Work Commission accepted the ACTU's point or submission put that means there's effectively no change to the net position of impacted workers relative to their current state. Now, turning to point about business profitability, the Fair Work Panel, I should say, referred to in its paragraph 100 to the report of Professor Borland, who found that business profitability improved throughout 2020 and was higher in 2020 than in previous years, in aggregate and almost universally across industry groups. He also found that every industry had higher profits in 2020 compared to the previous 3 years, although there's obviously variations between industries on that point. Nevertheless, this situation goes to a point that was made in the minutes of the most recent monetary policy meeting of the Reserve Bank of Australia, namely that notwithstanding this situation, firms are still refusing to increase wages. In those minutes, they point out that firms facing labour shortages were citing a preference for non-wage measures to attract and retain staff, such as one-off bonuses and working arrangements. Some firms are also opting to ration output because of labour shortages rather than pay higher wages to attract new workers. This goes once again to our general point about the need for binding institutional increases in wages to play the strong and significant role in increasing wages growth in Australia generally, obviously, and particularly in Western Australia. Those are going to be needed to bring about the increases in consumption that support the Reserve Bank of Australia's upside scenario for the economy. So as we mentioned earlier, the Fair Work Commission has not granted an increase in our view that will improve living standards. Research from the RBA has shown that compared to low-income households, high-income households tend to allocate a greater share of their spending to discretionary services, such as travel and recreation, as well as to durable goods. By contrast, low-income households tend to allocate a larger share of spending to non-durable goods and rents. That is, the low-paid are more likely to spend a higher proportion of their earnings on non-discretionary or essential items, and relative price increases in non-discretionary items compared to discretionary items is likely to have a greater impact on the low pay. And the Commission pointed out that from the information before us, the Fair Work Panel, non-discretionary items are likely to have a greater influence on overall CPI, that over the longer term prices for non-discretionary items have increased more than discretionary items. And any decline in prices of the non-discretionary items in June quarter 2020, most recently, is likely to be transitory and has since increased. And as Unions WA made the point in its submissions, the divergence between discretionary and non-discretionary CPI inflation should be noted when considering the cost of living and the needs of low-paid in WA. As these will be, increases in non-discretionary costs, that is, will be more impactful for low-income workers. Now, Unions WA argues that the results of delaying operation dates for minimum award wages was such that low-wage state award reliant workers had no increase in their pay for 6 months. This would effectively amount to a fall in living standards for workers during this period, and thus meant that the decision did not contribute, as it needs to do under the Act, to improve living standards for employees. Inflation, various points, still increased over the period of the delay, while wages did not. We'd also point out that, and similar to what the government has said, that delays to increases in certain awards has potential to create confusion and certainly distort some relativity and can also potentially run counter to the principle of equal remuneration, so that employees with similar or comparable levels of skills would also receive different wages. We'd also point out that the Fair Work Commission has flagged that it is not intending to make a continuing practice of delaying the operating dates of minimum wage increases. They point out in their paragraph 303 of their decision, it follows that the default or usual position is that variations to a national minimum wage order and modern award minimum wages arising from review is to operate from the 1st of July in the financial year following the review. Absent a case being made out for exceptional circumstances to exist in respect of a particular modern award, any variations arising from next year's review will operate from the 1st of July 2022. Now, the national accounts figures that were referred to by the Fair Work Commission also showed, obviously, that Western Australia was the strongest performing economy in Australia. Bearing in mind that travel to WA, as in people moving here for work, has also been increasing recently, as the ABS found out yesterday. It's also the case that consumer confidence surveys, such as those done by, most recently released by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, are showing extremely positive results for WA. And the Fair Work Commission noted in section 94 of its decision, or paragraph 94 of its decision, in line with expectations of strong demand for labour throughout 2021, job vacancies as a proportion of the labour force are at historically high levels at over 2%. And with that in mind, issues about labour supply begin to come into play insofar as there is increasing demand, higher job vacancies, increasing demand for labour. It's not simply the case that WA having a higher minimum wage, WA award-reliant workers and WA award-covered businesses having a sort of like higher labour costs. It also means that they are actually in a competitive advantage when it comes to labour supply issues. So the difference between the state minimum wage and the national minimum wage and award rates do in fact work in those sorts of circumstances in businesses' favour if they're looking for opportunities to advance and grow and take advantage of the growing economy. With that in mind, the Unions WA claim, and obviously supported by WACOS as well, a 4% or a $30.40 increase, we believe meets the statutory criteria that the WA Commission must consider for a minimum wage increase. And the full benefit of that increase really needs to operate straight away into the first pay period of the upcoming financial year. And with that, that concludes our submissions on the matter. We thank the Commission in court session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dyer. Yes, thank you very much for those submissions indeed. Thank you. Well, we acknowledge the assistance of all of you in the course of these proceedings. Both your written and oral submissions have been very helpful to us, and we appreciate the effort that you put into your preparation and presentation before us. What we now will do is formally reserve our decision, and my associate will inform you just as soon as we're in a position to hand that down, which, given today is now the 18th of June, we will endeavour to do so as soon as physically possible. Until that time, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
We stand adjourned.